On the Blueprint Improving State Workforce Data webinar. I'll turn you over to Policy Analyst Jenna Leventoff, and we can get started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Building on the Blueprint. Can we get the first slide, please? Thank you. Today we're going to review state progress on workforce data, and we're going to feature policy and advocacy lessons from Colorado and Arizona, both of whom have worked on policies to improve workforce data. Next slide, please. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists today, Shar Robert from the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, and Gretchen Corey from the Arizona Office of Economic Opportunity. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Workforce Data Quality Campaign is a project of the National Skills Coalition, and we're dedicated to promoting state and federal workforce data policies that help to ensure a skilled workforce. Next slide, please. We're going to start today with a brief discussion of the national trends in workforce data. These are gathered from the results of our 2016 Mastering the Blueprint survey. We've conducted this survey annually since 2014, and it asked state officials about how their state data systems align with the 13 elements that we believe make for a high-quality data system. This year, the survey represents all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Next slide, please. Nationwide, states are doing really well. They're improving on 11 out of the 13 elements on the blueprint, so we're really pleased to see this. Next slide, please. The blueprint has identified 3 areas where states are making particularly notable progress. Those areas are labor market information capacity and use, knowing if graduates get jobs, and creating cross-agency councils. So according to the blueprint, 46 states are advancing towards improving their labor market information collection, analysis, and distribution. Usually they're going to make this information available to the public online. The survey also shows that 45 states are advancing towards linking education and workforce training data with unemployment insurance records. What this does is it helps us learn whether graduates find employment and how much they're earning. That said, program coverage on linkage with wage records isn't entirely even. Most states are more likely to have wage outcomes for 2- and 4-year public colleges, WIOA Title I programs, post-secondary CTE, as well as adult ed programs. These linkages are less common for participants in programs like SNAP or TANF. Finally, states are making a lot of progress in advancing towards creating cross-agency councils. So 41 states are working towards creating a council that's overseeing a data system. These councils are usually staffed from across the education and workforce spectrum. So they have representatives from K-12, from career and technical education, higher education, and labor. Next slide, please. There's still some challenges where a lot of states are kind of working to pick stuff up. Next slide, please. Thank you. Back one, I think. 23 states have reported making only minimal progress towards creating policies that establish a process for industries, like, say, manufacturing, to say what credentials are useful to them and to give that input. Additionally, only 16 states, they're making minimal progress towards getting information like certifications, certificates, licenses, and industry-awarded credentials into their longitudinal data system. Next slide, please. So that's just a really brief overview. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you're interested in your state's progress on workforce data, you can go to our website to see how your state is doing. Each state page will have the links to this year's survey results. And you can also find our full blueprint publication on the Resources and Events tab under WDQC Publications. Next slide, please. To accompany our national stand of state workforce data, we're really pleased to release Data Policy Toolkit. This offers information about the policies and legislative templates that states can enact to improve the data infrastructure and promote data use in their states. These policies don't exactly correspond with our blueprint, but they're still important steps to help states achieve the blueprint's vision. We highlighted these particular policies just because a lot of states have had success with their implementation and other states have expressed interest in doing something similar. So the toolkit is broken down into 2 sections. One is for policies to help build data infrastructure, and the other is for policies to effectively use that data. So for each section, I'm just going to talk a bit about the specific policies that we've advocated for. Next slide, please. Just as a quick note, there's a lot of states that are making really amazing progress. As I've said, the blueprint shows overall net progress on 11 out of 13 elements. That said, even if you're in a state that's really advanced data-wise, you can still benefit from getting something into legislation. It's going to institutionalize your best practice and make sure that if there's a change in the governor or a change in agency leadership, or even just changes in staff, that these really good programs can continue. Next slide, please. So the first recommendation is the toolkit is establishing a longitudinal data system. These are systems that match records over time, and they can be used to show how various programs are working together. Our sample legislation has 4 key components of a longitudinal data system. So it's going to have a section describing how longitudinal data systems are useful. We think this is really important because most people are unfamiliar with what a longitudinal data system is. And so this is going to help policymakers and staff understand what they're working towards and why they're building it. Second, we want the legislation to mandate a system that includes the full spectrum of education and workforce training data. This is going to ensure that the system has all the information it needs to be useful to evaluate more programs than just K-12 programs or maybe 4-year institutions. We also believe that it should be broad enough that it's not going to be outdated in a few years. So you want to avoid listing specific technologies because we all know technology moves quickly, and in a couple of months it might be outdated, so you don't want to get that into legislation. Finally, this legislation should reflect how important it is to protect privacy. Our legislation has a lot of nods to protecting privacy and security, including we want to create an annually reviewed data governance policy. That's going to include the procedures for collecting, using, and storing data, a data security plan, as well as kind of restricted access based upon an employee's role, how much training they have on protecting data, and whether they're authenticated. Next slide, please. Another important way to improve state data is to make sure that states have in place legislation for a governance body. And like I was talking about before with the Cross-Agency Council, this will have representatives from agencies including early childhood education, K-12, career and technical education, from workforce programs, from 2- and 4-year schools, even social services and labor. This is going to make sure that all of the agencies will have a stake in the system and can provide input. Usually it also helps improve cooperation. When a state has a cross-agency council, there's a less hard time getting data from across the different programs. So we believe that this legislation should outline the duties of the Governance Council, but also the duties of the longitudinal data system staff, so that everyone is clear as to who does what. So just for example, usually the Governance Council will create a research agenda. That way they can make sure that this is aligned with agency policy priorities, whereas staff of the longitudinal data system could focus on technical issues like conducting data matching. Next slide, please. A third place where legislation is useful is authorizing data sharing. This can be between state agencies in the same state, between state agencies and the institutions in their state like colleges, or between agencies across different states. This sort of legislation isn't always necessary if there's a longitudinal data system, as usually entities can share data without a law mandating it so long as there's a contract to that effect. But this legislation can encourage hesitant agency officials to share data, or it can overcome sort of strict or misinformed interpretations of privacy laws. It can also be used by states that don't have longitudinal data systems so that they can at least do some research or planning and evaluation. We want this legislation to give a lot of detail about what the sharing is going to entail, including what the data can be shared for, who needs to share it, who can get it, and also just include the related privacy and security concerns, or procedures, excuse me. Next slide, please. A final way that we can focus on improving data infrastructure in the states through legislation is securing state funding. This is really essential to ensure the longevity of state longitudinal data systems, even when federal grants run out. Right now, most state longitudinal data systems are funded through federal grants, but these grants eventually go away, and so this funding can come from the state in a line item or simply just providing money to the agencies running the system, whether that be an independent state agency created to run the system or just all of the agencies that contribute data. Our legislation has a section that's appropriating state general funds to the SLDS, but it also says that the longitudinal data system can get federal funding or collect fees from people that want data, or it can take other contributions so that no source of funding is necessarily turned away, because how each system is funded is going to depend state by state. Next slide, please. The next section of our toolkit talks about ways that we can promote data use through legislation. So most of these are pretty similar. They take data and put them into an understandable format, but the main difference is who the intended audience is. So for scorecards, these are intended to help students and workers see program outcomes. So they can see whether past students have gotten jobs, how much they earn, and it's going to help them decide if a particular program or institution is right for them. So to be useful, scorecard legislation should do three things. It should have information about selecting a career, so maybe the demand for certain occupations in the future, or program cost information or the characteristics of students. It should also have information about student outcomes. This is going to include how many students are completing programs, whether those students find employment, and their earnings information. It's also, we believe that a scorecard should include all institutions as well as program level data. So most scorecards contain data about public institutions because states don't have access to information from private institutions. And Shar will talk about this more during her presentation. But when a scorecard contains information about private schools as well, or a workforce training programs in addition to just public 2- and 4-year institutions, it really helps students understand all of their options. So our legislation has sections that require institutions to submit program level data so that you can see the difference between, an English program at a school or an engineering program or the like. Finally, it's really important that states publicize the scorecards. This doesn't have to be in the legislation, but ultimately these tools are only useful if students know about them. Next slide, please. Our second data use recommendation is creating dashboards. So like scorecards, these put information in an easy-to-understand format, but they're more geared towards policymakers. So legislation creating dashboards should be sure to require annual updates. We want the tools to contain useful and recent information. It should also ideally use information from the state longitudinal data system so that the tools can show information about a variety of programs. And finally, if the report focuses on WIOA programs, it should use the primary indicators of performance outlined in WIOA in order to ensure alignment. Next slide, please. Our third suggestion is feedback reports. So these are similar to scorecards and dashboards. They just repackage information to answer the questions that educators and program managers have. They can use this to adjust curriculum or elements of their training programs to ensure that they're as effective as possible. Schools and other service providers are usually also more motivated to provide data to state agencies and longitudinal data systems if they're getting back useful information. So in order to make sure that these reports are actually useful to educators, they should contain data that breaks down outcomes by programs, by cohorts, or by target populations, to say women or minorities, or maybe another category of interest like students that start mid-semester. Usually this data is aggregated, which means it contains data about the students in bulk, but depending on the state and federal privacy laws as well as institution needs, it could be individual level, but just anonymized so that you don't know which student is which. Next slide, please. Our final recommendation is supporting skill gap analysis. Often this is called a supply and demand report. So these reports are going to assess the state's education and workforce training programs and to see if there's the right number of people being trained for industry jobs. So it'll look at occupational demand, basically what projections are for how many skilled workers a certain occupation will need, as well as how many people are being trained with the credentials that could be used for that job. So our legislation recommends that the report include the number of projected job openings broken down by major occupation or occupational cluster, as well as the level of education and training needed to fill those jobs. We also recommend that it includes the number of people currently completing those education and training programs, as well as identifying places where there's a gap in the supply and demand so that policymakers can step in and take action. We've seen this before. If a state's not training enough people to fit demand, they can maybe create a new education program or create some sort of credit to gear people towards that sort of program to stop the gap. Next slide, please. So I'm always happy to take questions. My email address is on here, and of course we'll have a question and answer period after the other two speakers. But with that update, I'd like to introduce Shar Robert. She leads the Colorado Skills to Compete Coalition, and she's going to tell you about a bill that the coalition was working to advance and how the coalition's engaged in advocacy. After that, Gretchen Corey is going to discuss advocacy from the agency perspective. And this is all intended to show you that it doesn't matter if you are a workforce training professional or someone working in state government, you have the capability to create change in the data world in your state. So next, Shar, take it away. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Jenna. So this is Shar Robert, coordinator of the Colorado Skills to Compete, and I think it's tremendously ironic that I was asked to be on the webinar because I am not a data geek. I do work with people who know a lot about data and do research, and as an advocate, I'm always happy to have data, but this was definitely a crash course in data. It is not my background at all. Policy wonk, yes, a tax nerd, advocate, those are kind of more my roles. Next slide. So our local affiliate of the National Skills Coalition is called Skills to Compete Colorado, and it was formed as kind of a cross-sector policy advocacy coalition focusing on helping folks access the training and education they need to get a good paying, in-demand, stable job with a future. We have always focused on advocacy. We have about 120 folks on our mailing list, and we have, I would say, 30 to 35 active members who come to at least most meetings. Some of the things that we have been able to accomplish, beginning in 2012, we did advocate for the Colorado Skills for Job Act report, which is very much like one of Jenna's last slide in terms of how many people are we graduating and how many job openings are there. And that became or morphed into what's called the Colorado Talent Pipeline Report. The following year in 2013, we successfully advocated for a bill that integrates basic education with skills training. A lot of folks can't access skills training because they lack a high school degree or a high school equivalency degree, and we were able to pass that legislation so that people could get some skills training at the same time they were obtaining their high school credential. In 2014, we gladly gave up the distinction of being the only state in the United States that was not putting any state money into adult education, and we worked on a bill that put a little under $1 million into adult education workforce partnerships, which are adult ed providers who are working with skills trainers and employment programs to help people go through the whole continuum of acquiring a high school equivalency degree and job relevant skills and ultimately a job. In 2015, we successfully advocated to get Colorado to adopt both the HiSET and TASK test in addition to the GED as tests for a high school diploma. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, back one. Okay, so we had talked about the issue of private occupational schools for a while. The concern that our group had discussed are folks who really could benefit by getting skills training but actually weren't able to access skills training because of prior experience that didn't end well with certain private occupational schools, where they may have pursued a certificate through a private school. Some dropped out before completing it, some got the degree but didn't get a job. And that either scenario ended up with a lot of debt. In many cases, they may have used up the benefits to which they might have been eligible on their previous experience. And if they had debt payments but couldn't get a good job, based on their training, they also could end up with bad credit that affected their future employment outlook. And as we talked about it, we had a member who was very connected to the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, and he drafted this particular goal for us to look at some consumer information in terms of what is really the cost of the kind of training people are getting, what's the total cost, how long will the loans last, and can they earn enough after their training to repay the loan. Next slide, please. So that's kind of how we started, is we thought, okay, well, let's have kind of a light hand. We didn't want to, you know, add a regulatory burden onto private occupational schools, but just to provide more consumer information. And that's kind of how we started working with the data quality, Workforce Data Quality Campaign. So we have experience in doing advocacy, and so as we decided to get into this issue, some of the elements that we were looking at is to do a lot of research. This is quite complex. I didn't know a lot about data. I wasn't real clear on the difference between Title IV schools and private occupational school versus eligible provider trainers that are certified to provide services under WIOA, and then later it's like, well, what schools are, you know, what are schools required to do to get approval for former soldiers to use them for the GI Bill. And we would do side-by-side comparison charts of, well, what's in the law already, what's in rule already, what are the different systems and asking of schools already. And then we formed a committee to work on a draft. We also invited and had participation by the State Division of Private Occupational Schools, because we wanted to design something that could work. And so we needed to know enough about what the state was already doing, what the systems were, to make a bill that that would work. We identified a legislative sponsor, Senator Rhonda Fields. She represented the area where there were a couple of major school closings in the last year, the sudden closure of ITT and also Heritage College, two private schools that had displaced a number of students in her district. We also tried to figure out you know, what was already being collected from other schools, and kind of our guiding principle was we didn't want to ask more of private occupational schools than we were asking of other schools, the public institution, and WIOA service providers. And we also did that thinking, well, let's build on what we already had. We did reaching out, trying to get stories from students who have attended the schools, and we promoted the issue through our blogs, through Twitter, and through email. And next slide, please. Okay, we had sort of looked at the issue for a couple years, and it took a long time to get a handle on it because there was progress being made. So some of the progress being made, you know, that we noted, and we were trying to figure out, well, does this take care of the need? The first thing was under WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, the eligible provider training list moved over under the Department of Higher Ed, and it really kind of cleaned up. We had a number of training providers under WIA, the former act, that really were not schools that were approved by the state, and so it really kind of cleaned that up. And so there now is a website in progress devoted to listing these different eligible providers, and the website is listed there. There also, we had the Launch My Career state website, Go Public, which has a lot of the good outcome information and expense information. The problem there is it just covers 31 of the almost 400 or 500 schools in Colorado, and only a handful of the private schools. It's primarily the public schools. Under the Obama administration, we had enforcement of the gainful employment rule, and also the unveiling of the college scorecard that does have a lot of the information, not specific to the particular program, and it only includes certain private schools who, about 20% of our private schools, who are eligible to receive the Title IV funding. And so we did want to recognize there was things going on, but none of them seemed to really address our concern about the private occupational schools. Next slide. So we did propose a bill, and many, many thanks to the Data Quality Campaign, who spent many, many hours in the last couple months trying to come up with a draft bill. And basically what it does is it does two basic things. The first thing is kind of a point of sale information. It added to what a private occupational school had to give to prospective students a couple of things in addition to what they already have to give to students. And the new elements were program completion rates, transfer rates if they know them, and most importantly, employment rates and median salary. Also typical student loan debt if they're a Title IV school. Next slide. The second big thing that it did was to kind of name an official to say that we're going to have an online free comparative tool so that all of the different education and training options are available in one place. This is referred to in the slide, in Jenna's slides before me, as a scorecard. Our sponsor didn't like that word because it sounded very judgmental, that the government was going to issue a stamp of approval, and so we ended up with comparative tool because we didn't know if it was going to be, you know, always be a website, or maybe it might be some kind of phone app, or might be something else we hadn't anticipated. And after a while, we figured out that the Department of Higher Ed could build out their current list of eligible training providers and add in new information, including the earnings and the student loan debt information. And then it would also add in those private schools who weren't necessarily trying to get WIOA funding. Next slide. Okay, so as of this point, this was yesterday, and our bill had a hearing in the Senate State Veterans and Military Affairs Committee. We had a number of our members testify, Frank Waters from Bell Policy, Christina Postolowski from the Young Invincibles, Allison Friedman from the Women's Foundation of Colorado, and Dave Ortiz from the United Veterans Committee. And each of them talked about why this kind of tool is so needed. We had two witnesses against. We had an owner of a private school who also serves on the state's private occupational school board, even though he was speaking as an individual. And then we had Karen McGrath, who heads up the trade association, the Colorado Association of Career Colleges and Schools. The two witnesses against were saying their basic message was that the bill would be burdensome and onerous and would be a hardship to the smaller private schools, and that due to the cost of database and staff, that it was likely fees were going to go up on the school, and that would force them to raise tuition costs, and that would result in it only hurting the students that we're trying to help. Anyway, their message prevailed. The bill failed 3-2, and that was as of yesterday. But in the meantime, we've certainly learned a whole heck of a lot about how we might approach the issue, whether by doing a similar bill next time or helping to publicize the efforts that the state currently does have, or possibly approaching the issue in a different way. Our bottom line is that students should, in order to make a good decision of whether training is worth it, they need some critical information, not just the cost of the program and the length of the program, but to be able to answer the question of, if I invest the time and money, will this result in enough likelihood of getting a better job or a salary increase that it is worth the time and investment? And I think I will leave it at that. There's more information about Skills to Compete on our website, cclponline.org, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Shar. I'd now like to hand it over to Gretchen Corey from Arizona to talk about advocacy from an agency perspective.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Corey, and I'm with the Office of Economic Opportunity. And like Jenna said, I'm going to be talking today about how we advocated for data sharing and going over some of Arizona's legislative changes to support those efforts. Next slide, please. Well, with the passage of WIOA, really that's when Arizona's workforce partners, we started meeting regularly with the underlying goal of to develop implementation strategies for the new law. And as part of that effort, a cross-agency data sharing work group was established to identify any barriers to meeting the WIO reporting requirements. And the group started really with looking at the barriers to UI data sharing, because we knew we would need UI data for the WIOA common performance measures, and the workforce partners, we'd all had a lot of frustration with trying to get access to that data. Previously, in the state of Arizona, the UI administration did interpret the federal law, the exception language, very strictly, so it was very difficult to get access to that data. And so once we looked at everything, and as a group, we did identify that there was a need for a state law change to support UI data sharing in our state. And that was based on really reviewing the federal law. And there was a provision in there that indicated that UI data sharing is allowable from one public official to another if the redisclosure is authorized in state law. And so the group started over several months' work to develop consensus on statutory language. Without it being authorized in state law, our UI administration would only share if you had a separate public official. So if you were a state agency that the main public official above you would be the governor, that wasn't a separate public official, so you couldn't get it. So it was a very convoluted, complicated way of interpreting the federal law. In addition to developing some statutory language, we did also concurrently work on briefing policymakers in the governor's office, and then when appropriate, the legislature, on how other states have used UI data to inform their policy decisions, and how UI data can be used to direct workforce funding to programs that really work in terms of increasing participants' earnings. Next slide, please. In addition to meeting these things, we also developed a lot of briefing documents that were used to develop gain partner consensus and policymaker support. And we covered a lot of different topics. Whatever seemed to be the most pressing question of the week, I was asked to develop a briefing document on. But some examples were potential uses of UI data, documents looking at explaining the interaction of state and federal law, talking about the difference between a centralized versus a federated model for sharing data. There was a lot of concern about privacy and security, and so we did some briefing documents on safeguards associated with a longitudinal database, and then examples from other states. That's always very compelling, and so we put together briefing documents of examples from other states. In general, I believe that putting these things in writing did help get everyone on the same page, and it also helped us respond to questions when they came up, which brings me to the last bullet. As a general rule, I believe it's very important to respond as quickly as possible to all inquiries about legislation, just to keep it moving. And if there's an unanswered question out there you don't want that to be the reason that the bill dies. Next slide, please. Our efforts were successful, and HB 2666 was introduced. And yes, the number was noticed and was strange, and was even a point of discussion at one point on the floor. But all the same, the UI data sharing provisions were included in that bill, and they were designed to support the evaluation of the longitudinal evaluation of the workforce system. We were able to use the majority of the language that the work group had developed, which I think was positive, though we did have to modify it some due to the decision to create a new office. And what ended up happening was the bill, I would want to note that we had worked on putting together UI data sharing language, and then once we began talking with executives, it got included in a larger bill, which was a package of policy changes designed to increase the competitiveness of Arizona through workforce development, regulatory and tax reform, and the consolidation of the industrial finance authorities. And to give you an idea, the entire bill was 105 pages. The data sharing portion represented 4 pages. The short title of the bill was the Governor's Economic Opportunity Office Consolidation. And that created the new office. I'm a part of the Office of Economic Opportunity. And I do believe, well, it's probably pretty apparent, but having this be a bill that was sponsored by the governor is a big factor which helped pave the way for us getting it through the first session that it was introduced. But what ended up, OEO was created by bringing together economists and workforce staff from 3 separate agencies. The director of the office is charged with developing data-informed policies, and he's also the workforce planning coordinator, which is a role that is being sort of determined as we work with the other agency partners in this area, and figuring out exactly how we will fulfill that role is being negotiated right now with the other agencies. And OEO is authorized to fulfill unemployment insurance data requests along with the Department of Economic Security. The bill specifies that both agencies can share UI data. The Department of Economic Security is the agency that houses the Unemployment Insurance Administration in Arizona, and so while OEO was granted the right to also redisclose that data, that ability was not removed from DES. Next slide, please. The data policy toolkit would have been useful when we were developing our statutory language because without a resource like that, we reviewed a lot of other language from different states, and everyone's statutes are put together a little differently, so that can be complex in finding how to apply them to your individual state statutory structure. And we also spent a lot of time reviewing the federal regulations to make sure all of those points were covered. And having gone through that, I can say that the toolkit provides a good roadmap of the issues to be addressed, though at the same time I think additional provisions can be needed to address specific state issues. For example, in Arizona, the Workforce Data Task Force is charged with defining the UI data retention period for longitudinal analysis of workforce and education programs. And we created that formality on purpose because we believed that trying to have an agency negotiation about that retention period or having it set in stone in statute, that it was much preferable to have this formal body that was able to decide it like that. I also wanted to note that another unique or different thing about Arizona's bill versus what was described in the blueprint about having the intent language that explained, what you were going to do with a longitudinal system, because of just sort of the the tone of the session last year in the political environment, we really only mentioned longitudinal in our bill in one place, and that is here where the task force determines the retention period. And we specifically removed it from most other places in the bill just because of the climate and the concerns about longitudinal systems in the last legislative sessions in our legislature. And just to give you an example, there was a bill that did not pass, but there was a bill that was introduced that forbid our Department of Education from spending any money on any further construction, enhancement, expansion, or expansion of any statewide longitudinal data system designed to track students beyond grade 12. So there is a real hesitancy in Arizona sometimes to do those kinds of things, and so we were careful how we framed our bill, but also gave ourselves the ability to develop a longitudinal system. Also, our participation in the longitudinal system, which we're terming the Arizona Workforce Evaluation Data System, is voluntary in Arizona. And another unique part of our bill that's a little unique to Arizona's situation is that the way that OEO was established as a workforce data steward, and we are responsible for holding the UI data for long periods, and then we are able to redisclose it to the authorized public officials, is an arrangement a little unique to Arizona. It seems, I think the way the bill was written, we actually were asked many questions, and the Workforce Data Quality Campaign helped a lot in clarifying if that would be allowable or not. The way that the language was written, it is allowable, but it ultimately depended on how we implemented it, and we definitely took in DOL's UI administration, the federal UI program concerns and thoughts, and implemented it in such a way that they were fine with it. And our data sharing agreement has been approved. Next slide, please. There are some specific provisions I wanted to note that really do correspond very directly to the Data Policy Toolkit. In Arizona, we established a Workforce Data Task Force, which corresponds to the board, the cross-agency board that's established in the Toolkit language. And our task force is responsible for overseeing the development of the longitudinal system, the Arizona Workforce Evaluation Data System. The agencies that are permitted to participate are defined in statute. However, as I mentioned, participation is not mandatory. The Toolkit's language does compel participation, which is definitely preferable. However, in Arizona, language that had mandated participation would have been met with strong resistance. And so in order to ensure that to prevent people from having that reason for killing the bill, we opted to make it voluntary, though that does create some development challenges because we have to do a lot to work to keep the partners interested, engaged, and to want to participate in our system. And the also third point that corresponds to guidance in the toolkit is that the importance of security and confidentiality was addressed throughout Arizona's legislation, with the task force being charged with developing the controls for the data confidentiality and data privacy. Next slide, please. And these are just the provisions within the bill, and the URL down there is down below that specifically pertain to data sharing within the bill. As I said, it's a lengthy bill, and most of the language does not pertain to data sharing, and you have to read through a lot of bill language to find the data sharing info. Next slide, please. And after the bill passed and we moved on to implementing the provisions of the bill, we really did have a lot of flexibility because the language was written very broadly. We could have developed a centralized system. We could have developed a federated system. We did opt for a federated model, and we began briefing partners and the task force members on our design. And the guiding principles of our design, there's two key guiding principles. One, that no personal identifiable information will leave the host agency, and that we would develop a matching process that supports macro data analysis without the PII. I wanted to point out that these guiding principles were not in statute, and these are self-imposed restrictions that we've established upon OEO when we redisclose data. I do think that there are that this is how we want to do it, and to do something a little different than just responding to data requests as the UI administration does now. But I do believe that our concern for privacy and confidentiality did help us gain the trust and confidence of the UI administration when we were working to develop the data sharing agreement. That ultimately went very smoothly, and it has historically been a very difficult process. So there was that benefit of those restrictions also. The statute required us to sign an MOU by September 30th, which we did do. And we in Arizona decided to view the MOU as more of an intent document that then needed to be followed with a detailed UI data sharing agreement. And in the MOU, it includes provisions such as that OEO shall only redisclose de-identified data. It also specifies that DES is not held to that restriction, that they can redisclose UI data with PII. It defines the sources of the UI data that OEO is going to use in the workforce data system. And then it specifies when the data sharing agreement and the ISA needed to be completed. And that was by the end of the year, and that was also able to be done on time. Next slide, please. It really did take a great deal of cooperation between the two agencies to complete the data sharing agreement in 3 months. As I have alluded to, the UI agency historically really had no incentive, or seemed to have no incentive to share their data, and only saw drawbacks in terms of security risk. This time around, however, because top executives at each agency had committed to meeting the deadline, it seems that their awareness of the benefits of UI data sharing helped pave the way for overcoming the staff objections, along with, as I mentioned, our focus on security. Because we had this very quick approaching deadline, everyone really had to focus on the agreement, and it helped us work through the issues expeditiously. And throughout that 3 months, we did consult with the U.S. ETA Unemployment Insurance Program staff for guidance. And so this helps when they got the final agreement for them to be able to sign off quickly, and just to be aware of how we were implementing Arizona's law, and was it in line with federal regulations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, one more back. I'm sorry. So our next steps, right now we're in the process of developing an RFP. The RFP will cover the development, implementation, and maintenance of our federated longitudinal system, which we're calling AWED. We anticipate releasing that RFP at the end of March, and right now we are engaging partners to be part of that evaluation team. We believe that having partners part of the evaluation team will increase their buy-in and their confidence in the contractor chosen and the system being developed, which is really important to the success of the system, because without the participation mandate, as I mentioned, OEO must keep the partners interested and engaged. We anticipate having the partners sign a joint development agreement. And, you know, honestly, it's difficult to develop a longitudinal system without a significant contribution of partner staff time. While all of the development costs will be funded by OEO, we will need partners engaged to build the federated system. So the one carrot we have is that partners that opt out of initial development and decide to join join the system AWEDS at a later time, they may be responsible for the costs associated with adding their program. And then this brings me to the funding point. This is the development of our system is state funded. It is a non-appropriated funding source, and so it is something that is not widely discussed. It's probably another reason why the word longitudinal, people, when we were initially drafting the bill, were nervous about that word being in there because that implies cost. And while there was a funding source, it was a non-appropriated funding source, and there were no questions about the potential cost of the system as the bill went through. However, obviously, we had spoken with the bill sponsor and with the governor's office that we intended to use the non-appropriated funding source that we would have available to us with the creation of the new office. And the third thing we are currently working on is developing consensus on initial reporting from the system. Next slide, please. And some of the very preliminary ideas that have been discussed is looking at the wages earned in the industry of completers compared to a cohort of non-completers at one-stop centers, adult education students, community college students, university students, and measuring that at 2 and 5 and 10 years after graduation or leaving the program prior to graduation if they're part of the matched cohort. There's also some interest in knowing if students end up working in the industry for which they receive training. And then the last two are issues that our universities are interested in understanding: the industries and counties in which university graduates find employment in Arizona. There is one large metropolitan area in Arizona, Phoenix, and then there's 3 universities, and the other universities feel that they train a lot of students to then come to the Phoenix metropolitan area, and they would like data to support that, other than anecdotal. And there's also an interest in understanding public service use before and after receiving public university and education, or that would also apply to any other receiving any workforce training programs. Does that impact public service usage? So with that, next slide, please. That's my presentation. If anybody has any questions, there's my email, and then we have time for a few questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Gretchen. We're going to open up the floor to questions now. We actually had a couple that came in during the presentation. So I am going to take the first one. We were asked if there's any scorecards that are actually being used by students now, and the answer to this is an enthusiastic yes. There's a handful of student information tools that are mentioned in our data policy toolkit. Off the top of my head, this is one of the biggest pushes that we're seeing now. There's a handful of states that are working towards legislation on this. In terms of what already exists, Minnesota has the Graduate Employment Outcomes tool. Texas has tools. South Dakota has a scorecard. And we have more examples on our Student Right to Know infographic, which you can find on our website. So there's that question. I think a question for the panelists that I have that I just think everyone would be interested to hear is a lot of people are really intimidated by data and data policy. There's data people and there's non-data people, right? Shar, you mentioned you weren't initially a data person, and I think a lot of people hear the term data and they freeze up a little bit if they're not a data person. Can either of you maybe talk to how you got over that hurdle when talking with people or policymakers, what you found to be most effective?
Well, this is Shar, and since I mentioned I'm not a data person, to me it's relating it back to the purpose of the data. And Gretchen gave some good examples on one of the last slides, you know, where people want to know, well, where are students getting jobs, or does having training result in less dependence on government programs? For us, what kind of drove us is, you know, the question of will an investment in education and training be worth it? And then to answer that question requires data of, well, it sort of depends whether something's going to be worth it, depending on how much it costs and how much time it'll take, and whether it improves your chance of getting a job, and whether your earnings will go up. And so the data serves the purpose of answering whatever is the most important question. And so we kind of emphasized the questions of, that in order for people to make good decisions, they needed to have all these pieces of information. And the mechanics of exactly how the data gets collected and shared and compiled is not a level that the legislators are definitely, they're not tuned into that level, but you have to answer that level before you're done. But it's the basic question, the basic policy question you want to have answered that requires the need for data.
Thank you so much, Shar. Another question that we've received is, are employers involved? So I want to talk to this one a little bit. I'm not sure about whether employers were involved in Arizona. I think there was sort of limited employer involvement in Colorado, just given the nature of the bill. But in a lot of other states, we actually are seeing employers really taking the lead on advocacy. So I think they realize that data is essential to ensuring that they're able to find the skilled workers that they need. One example of this is Alabama last week introduced a longitudinal data bill. I think we're hearing some feedback. Shar, Gretchen, could one of you mute, please? Thank you. So they introduced a longitudinal data bill last week, and it's having a hearing, I believe, today, possibly right now. And the drive to create that longitudinal data system was actually, it originated with employers, with the Alabama Workforce Commission. They thought it through and realized that data would really help narrow the skills gap in that state. Also in Michigan, there was a bill last year to share wage records with community colleges and I think workforce boards. And a Michigan Employer Association, one of our Business Leaders United members, actually wrote a letter in support of the bill. So to answer that question, yeah, I think employers really enjoy being involved in this process, and it's something that they definitely look to do a lot. In terms of another question for our panelists, do you have any sort of, can you speak to either of you the importance of finding the right legislature? Obviously, this all requires legislation, and can you say, Shar, you mentioned a little bit how you found the legislature, but Gretchen, if you want to speak to how you found the legislature, or if either of you want to speak to the difference that that made.
Well, let me, go ahead,
Shar. Oh, just very quickly, I mean, we really didn't find, we worked with the governor's office, and the governor's office found the sponsor, so.
And on our end, and it is something we're working around. Colorado is one of 3 states in the nation that has a split legislature where different parties control different houses. And so we have Democratic control of the House and Republican control of the Senate. And it, had, in terms of if we had things to do over again and had, an extra few months, I think part of what we could have worked harder on is to ensure bipartisan support prior to introduction of the bill by a Democratic senator in a Republican-controlled House. Politics do matter. Ours are not necessarily terribly different than some of the things Gretchen described for Arizona. There's some fundamental things about our bill that made it politically difficult. First of all, that we were asking something of private businesses, and that gets translated into kind of a categorical litmus test of don't put any regulations on business. And then second of all, the bill would actually require some staff time. It was actually a 0.7 FTE ongoing, but adding government employees is also kind of a political litmus test for bills. And so we had those 2 kind of uphill challenges early on. You know, there are ways to overcome such challenges, but we really didn't have time to take all the steps we needed to overcome some of the political challenges.
Thank you, Shar. I think it looks like we're about at time, so I just want to do one final question, and that's to ask if either of you have a takeaway from your advocacy efforts. We can start with Shar and end with Gretchen. If you both just want to say the one or two things that you took away from it that you think would be beneficial to the other people listening in on this webinar that are maybe thinking about doing some data advocacy in their states.
Well, I will add, I mean, what Gretchen brought up about have your bill be part of a bigger bill that actually has a lot of merit. I think some of the things we took away, you know, if you don't succeed at first, try again. There are some options that we could explore in terms of adding more voices, and that includes you know, some adding proponents of private occupational schools. We had some conversations but didn't have time to kind of confirm, because there are some private occupational schools who are very proud of their you know, outcome measures and could have been a good voice. Adding the voice of businesses and employers to the demand, I think, is always helpful. Having more out-state voices, you know, of folks who are outside the metro area of the state, and those are things that I think could be helpful. And then Colorado, you know, sometimes we don't necessarily do things because other states are doing it, but being the only state to not fund adult ed seemed to be a good tipping point for that. So we do try to monitor what other states are up to.
Thank you, Shar. And Gretchen, do you have a final takeaway before we wrap up? I think we might be having some technical difficulties. So with that, thank you all for tuning in today. Happy Valentine's Day. For those of you that didn't have your questions answered, I will try to go through and answer as many as possible. And of course, you should feel free to follow up with myself or either one of our panelists if you have further questions. Again, happy Valentine's Day and have a good afternoon. Bye.